and gives recommendations to the author about whether or not they'll publish their article. So it's a much more rigorous process than for example, submission to a magazine or a publication that doesn't have an expert review process. And so that's why they're considered more scholarly. Does that make sense? The gatekeepers are intense.
So we know if we hit this, I can actually just select this tab, and I'm going to see of the 160, I'm going to be just looking at the ones that are from peer-reviewed journals. So that's one thing I can do automatically to limit the search. Are there other things you can think of or need to add?
Sometimes limiting the language helps. Every once in a while you find language.
Right, so we could, depending on your language skills, you know, for me it would just be English that I could read a scholarly article in. So I can go back to that initial search page and I can change the language to English. And I can also select right there the journal articles. So they kind of make it easy on us here, right? So they tell us all these different ways. So we can, again, we can use a specific age group that they've defined. So I can choose adolescents there, in which case I would take it out up there, because it would be redundant. So I'm just going to do that.
It doesn't limit it by much, does it?
It didn't limit it very much. So do you all understand the difference between like a descriptor, or do you know what a descriptor is when you see it in the database over here? What do you think those are?
Maybe key terms that somebody's put in so that when you type in that search, it comes up.
Right, so they're key terms, and not to confuse people, because sometimes we call things keywords, right? So what I've done now, we would call keyword search. But these would be called descriptors or subject terms. But they are standardized throughout the database, so each item that's in the database has a set of these descriptors that are assigned to it. So it's showing me for Article 1, you know, these are the different descriptors that have been assigned to it. So those can be helpful because I now know that that's the terminology that's used in the database. So what I can do based on that is I can change my keywords to subject terms. So now I know that television is a subject term in the database, and I also know that violence is. So I need to change this over here to descriptor. And so this should limit my search down, because I'm saying television, so I went from 100 to about 50. Because in the first instance, it was just searching for that word anywhere in the abstract or the article, as opposed to now where it's searching it as a key subject of the work. So, okay, in terms of narrowing, we've got publication date, we've got language, we have using subject terms. Are there any other things people can think of?
Did we limit it by setting or by geographic area, or we weren't concerned about that?
We didn't do that, but that would be another option, right? And we also have public populations, that's another one. We did the age. And then the other thing to keep in mind is that another good way to focus it, dependent on what angle you want to go with your research, is to add another search term, right? So to add an additional component to your topic. So perhaps instead of just adolescence and television violence, maybe we want to look then at a specific type of behavior, like aggressive behavior. So by adding an additional search term, we're going to focus even further on the search. Now we went down to So it's just important to keep in mind that it's going to take this iterative process. It is generally not a one search deal when you're doing research, so you're going to have to play back and forth with the different terms you use and how you set up your parameters in order to find what you're looking for your particular topic. And in terms of not having enough resources, it's more or less going the opposite ways, right? So perhaps you narrowed it too far. You have too many search terms, you can take one out. If you limit it by date, you can take that out. So you want to start broad and then narrow. One other thing to mention just when you're doing your research is that if you can't find anything on your topic, obviously you have a lot of resources to go to. So you have your professor, I'm a resource, you have all these different things that are out there. And if you find something that our library doesn't own, you can use the interlibrary loan service where we borrow it from another library for you, and that is paid for out of your tuition dollars, so feel free to use it. And if you interlibrary loan an article, it's going to take about 3 days, and they're going to get it to you electronically through your email account, so it's pretty easy to do that. And you would just request an article you find that we don't have online.
And they send you the full text, right?
Yep,
Of the
they'll send
article.
you the full text via your email.
Through the ILL, you get
Full text journal articles.
get out.
Unless
Yeah.
you request just certain pages. Yeah.
Huh, I didn't know that.
Yeah,
Okay.
so, just,
Yeah, I was just gonna ask. I like the way you go, sort of the front end to figure out what the subject terms are or the key descriptors for different articles, because it gets at the thesaurus for a particular database. But is there a point where students might want to look in the thesaurus and type in their term? Were you going to head there?
sure, yeah.
I think that's really helpful, having done an extensive amount of searching in different databases. And, you know, kids are called different things, educational settings are called different things in different databases. And sometimes they're the key word in that database, and sometimes they're more narrow. And so it's helpful to look that up, because then you figure out what the broader search term is.
Right, so if you're not sure what Professor Alwell's referring to, she's talking about these descriptor systems within databases. So each database has its own either thesaurus or what they call controlled vocabulary. So within Site Info, it is this thesaurus of psychological index terms. And we'll go there in a minute. And then within ERIC, I couldn't find the book, but it's the ERIC descriptors. And then within PubMed, it's medical subject headings. So there's a very structured, complex system behind these little words that you see. So if I want to use that system to make sure that the words I'm using, the definition of how the database defines them is the way I define them, I can use this little thesaurus at the bottom of the page. So if I go to this thesaurus, I can look up a term. So let me look up aggressive behavior. So in this case, I'm doing an alphabetical index search. So it's just bringing it up alphabetically. It has my term, so I'm going to click on the hyperlink. And so it has this system of hierarchies, right? So it tells me that aggressive behavior, I should use that for framing. And it tells me broader terms. So in this system, social behavior is the broader term, and then we have these narrower terms, and we have related terms. So if you were particularly interested in aggressive driving behavior, you should be using that term as opposed to aggressive behavior, because you want to use the most specific terminology for your subject. And when it has a plus next to it, it means, so for example, this behavior disorders, if I select that, I can see for that particular one, again, broader terms, narrower terms, and related terms. And so back in the old days, before we had Site Info, you had this book you had to go to, and you can see that it's just a whole list